The Trump administration's crackdown along the Mexican border isn't just limited to people trying to come here illegally. Now a growing number of Hispanic Americans are being denied passports because the government is questioning their citizenship. The Washington Post reports that the Trump administration is accusing hundreds and possibly thousands of people of using fraudulent birth certificates since they were babies. Now, the government alleges that some midwives and physicians along the border gave U.S. birth certificates to people who were actually born in Mexico decades ago. In a statement to the Washington Post, the State Department said it, quote, has not changed policy or practice regarding the adjudication of passport applications, and that the U.S.-Mexico border region happens to be an area of the country where there has been a significant incidence of citizenship fraud. It's true that this happened under George W. Bush and the Obama administrations, too. But that mostly ended after a government settlement in 2009. This new spike comes as taking away people's citizenship is on the rise under President Trump. Now, to try to understand this piece and this issue a little better, I'm joined now by NBC News national security and justice reporter Julia Ainsley and attorney Jaime Diez, who represents some of the U.S. citizens who have either been denied passports or had them taken away. Welcome to both of you. Julia, let me start with you. When did this begin? How pervasive do we think it is? And is this connected to the sort of prediction, if you will, that this was the next thing Stephen Miller, who's sort of the chief advisor on all immigration issues in the West Wing, this is the next step he wanted to take?
Chuck, context here is critical. You're exactly right. We know that Stephen Miller, the next step he wants to do is to go after legal immigration. What we're seeing here is part of this new fraud crackdown from DHS and throughout the Trump administration, like the State Department. They're trying to go after people who maybe lied on their applications and became citizens or became permanent residents and got green cards who shouldn't have. And so they want to go back and re-adjudicate and take that away. But, of course, what happens and what the Washington Post laid out in this story is that a lot of people who were rightfully in the United States end up getting their rights taken away, too. And as they found under the Obama administration, it's very difficult to decide which ones of those birth certificates signed by those midwives in the 90s were legitimate and which ones weren't. And so they had really just decided it was a fruitless cause and that they should just allow them, take them as legitimate. But this is part of a broader crackdown. And from people I've spoken to who represent a lot of immigrants who are trying to move up the ladder, get passports, get citizenships, get green cards, they say before you take that next step, you need to go through your record and make sure everything is crystal clear, or it could just not even be worth it. It's too much of a risk because of the scrutiny they're doing, going back and looking at everything and every application you've put in earlier, even if they were legitimate, Chuck.
All right. Let me go to Jaime Diez. Jaime, I wanted Julia to begin there to help me continue to sort of lay out the context for all this. Now, walk me through what you're dealing with. How many clients do you have that have been impacted by this? How many of them are natural-born citizens versus those that went through the green card process and became naturalized citizens, born here versus naturalized, all of those things? I'm curious, what kind of folks are being targeted here?
No, here we're talking only about people that were born in the United States.
Okay. How many clients do you have on this front?
I have represented over 500 people. I presently have probably 30 people that are in lawsuits in federal court, and I have represented over 100 of them in lawsuits in federal court, where they have been taking away their documents. They have been put in rooms to admit that they were not born in the United States. Their mothers have been asked to come to Ciudad Juarez, to the consulate, to admit that they were not born there and their documents were taken. And what we're seeing now is that they're detaining them, and when they come back, without allowing them to come back and keep them in Mexico. There's many clients of mine that I have that were born in the United States, that the government has stopped them and have kept them in Mexico. And the crackdown is starting to be very hard. And they're doing every day. I see someone in my office. I practice in Brownsville, Texas, which is in the border with Mexico. And people that were born with midwives down there, there's a lot of them. But I can tell you something, that most of them were born in the United States. We even have a soldier that was born with a midwife. When he applied to become a soldier, they took him in. He applies for a passport, and they say, show us that you're a United States citizen. This is ridiculous.
Well, there was one example in the Washington Post, Mr. Diez, and I'm just curious if you've had to deal with something like this, where it was a former soldier, and he only wanted to give his first name because he was afraid he'd be targeted. And he said that the State Department told him that they weren't convinced he was a U.S. citizen, that they needed a bunch of the following documents: either evidence of his mother's prenatal care, his baptismal certificate, maybe rental agreements when he was a baby. This is a grown man. I'm sorry. I don't think my mother has the power bill from when I was born in 1972. Is this the burden of proof that's being put on your clients?
Yes, and that is what is going on. They're asking for things that no one has. No one in the whole United States has prenatal records from her mother. A person that is 40 years old, there's no way they have them. So they're asking for things that they know they don't have them. People get frustrated. But if you live in the border, there is a need for you to cross to the other side. You have family, you have things to do on the other side. And when they're coming back, that's when they're detaining them, they're putting them in proceeding them, or they're making them sign documents so that they can get away from it. What it is happening is outrageous. And they really, opportunity like this to tell the American people what is going on is incredible, because we're not talking about people that naturalized. We're talking people that were born in the United States. They just happen to have a Hispanic last name, and they were born with midwives. But that's still Americans.
Mr. Diez, have you had any client who didn't have an Hispanic last name who had their passport taken away?
Not that I can remember of right now on top of my head. Most of them have been taken away. No, I have people that I represented that have having difficulty getting a passport because they were born in southern Texas with a midwife. But someone that has their passport taken away, revoked when they were coming back, or through a letter in the mail, no, I have never had it.
So it does feel as if it's Hispanic surnames that get targeted here. Julio, walk me through the due process in this. Obviously, what are the court procedures here? You're accused of this. You're trying to fight back. Where does it go in the system?
It's really hard to fight back, Chuck. I mean, you would have to get a lawyer. I know a lot of people who stay outside of places where immigrants are trying to appeal, and they know that they will eventually come across the street and find lawyers, because it's nearly impossible to navigate this system on your own. As Jaime just pointed out, they're asking for these documents a lot of people don't have. And as an American citizen, yes, you have the right to get to have citizenship, but that passport, the documents that you have to have a passport, it's not a right to have a passport if you don't have the documents to back it up. And when they're raising this bar, there are actually very few routes to go. The way this was handled in the past, Chuck, was through a class action settlement. And that's frequently the way we see immigrants, or even U.S.-born immigrants, the children of immigrants, seek their rights, that they're able to go through the ACLU. They have to come in a class action suit with lots of people, and then they're able to get justice. And that's what happened in 2009 when the ACLU said, look, you can't tell which ones of these midwife birth certificates are legitimate and which ones aren't. And we think that it's a very small amount of children that were actually born in Mexico. And so therefore, you can't discriminate based on them having this one type of birth certificate. So the answer is it's really hard to get justice without a class action lawsuit in this case.
Mr. Diez, is there anything in the... Why is the burden of proof not on the government to prove you're not a U.S. citizen?
Well, the burden of proof is on you to prove by a preponderance of the evidence, and this is a civil case. And the government does not have any way to prove to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you fraudulently obtained that document. First of all, these are documents that were registered when you were a baby, and the only way that they would prove it is if you knew that that document was fraudulent when you grew up. So, what they do is they try to take you away from going to court. So that's why they detain you ports of entry, and they keep you and say, stay in Mexico. How do you come back if you were staying in Mexico and you were thrown into Mexico?
You're not a Mexican citizen. You're not a Mexican citizen. What are you going to do?
No, it is really, I mean, the stories, unfortunately, I have the time to tell you all the stories that I have seen of people. And, but I can tell you one thing. We have won all those cases. And what is sad is that after you win all those cases, you would think the government will say, you know what, I need to change. No, they go harder. They figure that eventually there will be no attorney that will represent these people, but I'm here to represent them.
Let me ask you this. Is there, how many of your clients have you felt like they've been detained longer than they should be, thrown in jail? And what would they thrown in jail for if they were?
Well, they were thrown in jail. They're not even jail. They get thrown to immigration detention centers. I had a guy that was detained for 3 days at a detention center.
An American citizen. An American citizen.
An American citizen. Yes, sir.
Put into a detention center, and just because what? He didn't have a passport, or they didn't believe his passport?
No, they had a passport. They just said, we have a note here that we need to revoke your passport. So they put him in a room, and the CBP agent asked him, do you want me to treat you like a Mexican or as a U.S. citizen? And what I would have told him, treat him like a human being, give him his rights. He has a right for you to hear what evidence do you think you have, but the way that they are treating people is not right.
All right. Julia Ainsley, Jaime Diez, I got to leave it there. I thank you both, sharing your expertise and your experiences there. Thank you. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.